depending on the pressure that you want and the amount of time that you want them to breathe. And usually this time is determined by your respiratory rate. And in pressure support, basically, this is a patient that is awake and able to do spontaneous breath, and you're just giving them a little bit of pressure whenever they're breathing, and it's not dependent on the amount of pressure that you want them to receive. It's not dependent on the amount of volume you want them to receive. So some of the variables that you would set on the vent is the tidal volume. The normal tidal volume that we would give is 4 to 8 mils per kilo of their predicted or ideal body weight. Normal minute ventilation is between 5 to 8 liters per minute. Their respiratory rate, the amount of oxygen that you want them to receive, the amount of PEEP, positive and expiratory pressure that you want them to receive, again to prevent opening and closing of what's called atelectatic trauma. But then this, you should really limit the PEEP in patients with asthma and COPD because they already have auto PEEP, because they can't necessarily exhale. But in patients that do not have the asthma and COPD, you need to give them a little bit of PEEP so that their lungs are not closing and opening too much. Pressure support is something that you would give in a couple of modes, and we'll talk about that. Basically, whenever the patient breathes, you don't want them to be sucking into the circuit, and that's a lot of work. You want to give them a little bit of pressure so that they can overcome that resistance in the circuit. And then the inspiratory flow rate, you can set that depending on how quickly you want them to receive that air. And this is usually more for the volume control type of mechanical ventilation. And then the inspiratory-expiratory time ratio is something that you would set in patients with in the pressure assist control vents. And then the peak inspiratory pressure, basically you can tell the vent to stop inhalation or inspiration once they reach a certain amount of pressure, so that the vent itself will never exceed that pressure when it's giving the breath. And then the inspiratory trigger sensitivity, basically how sensitive you want the vent to sense that the patient is triggering patient is trying to trigger a breath. So this can be useful in patients that are awake, who are, say, like a COPD patient that are having too much CO2. They can try to trigger that vent very too much, and the vent can deliver too much breath, but then it can cause breath stacking. So what you can do is decrease the sensitivity of that machine so that it's not, so even though the patient is trying to trigger a breath, it won't necessarily deliver a breath. Two most common set mode of ventilation that we would use is AC/VC, assist control, volume control, and SIMV with pressure support. With assist control, volume control, with volume control, say you have a patient that is completely apneic because you gave them you gave them a paralytic and you gave them a sedative, that they're not going to trigger a breath spontaneously. The machine will deliver a tidal volume that is machine triggered. But if you have a patient that is lightly sedated, they have a intact respiratory drive, they can actually trigger the machine to deliver an extra breath if the patient has a demand for it. So you can have the prescribed rate plus whatever the patient is triggering, and the machine will give you a volume that you prescribe consistently. So the big advantage of this is it's very restive to a patient. So if you're not having to pull in the volume by themselves, the machine is doing it for them. Their lungs, their diaphragm, and and themselves can rest and basically not do much work. And what's really good about this setting is that the tidal volumes and the minute volumes are predictable. You know how much this patient is going to get. The disadvantage is that in patients with asthma and COPD, you can give way too much, and the patient can trigger the vent themselves sometimes also, because you don't necessarily have to completely sedate or paralyze these patients. that they can trigger the vent, and then the vent will deliver, and it can cause too much minute ventilation and cause out-of-keep and dynamic hyperventilation. So one of the settings that we would sometimes use is SIMV with pressure support. In patients that are completely apneic and paralyzed, SIMV with pressure support is similar to ACVC. Because what you do with SIMV is you give a set amount of rate and a set amount of volume. Now if the patient is not triggering a breath or not breathing, then the machine will act as a volume control and will deliver those breaths, mandatory breaths. However, if you have a patient that is slightly sedated, is able to breathe, you can then do this SIMV, because what the machine will do is try to synchronize the patient's spontaneous breaths with the mechanical breaths, so that the patient will not get too excessive amount of breath. Say a patient with COPD, lightly sedated, who is able to trigger the vent spontaneously, then it'll get, the machine will develop a breath that same amount will develop a respiratory rate depending on the spontaneous breath and the mandatory breaths. The problem with it, and then you can give what's called pressure support. So whenever the patient is spontaneously breathing, the machine will not necessarily deliver a set amount of volume, but it will give a certain amount of pressure so that the patient can breathe comfortably and not having to suck in into the straw, the endotracheal tube, which can cause a lot of work and a lot of metabolic demand. So this is very advantageous in patients that are spontaneously breathing. So if you're having to wean them off ACVC, you can put them on SIMV with pressure support and basically take a look at how much this patient is able to spontaneously breathe and how much ventilatory support, and then kind of help you gauge how well the patient is breathing on their own. And then there's the pressure assist control ventilation. This is something that we would use mostly in patients that have lung transplants and pediatrics, because these two patient groups they're very sensitive to barotrauma, and so you don't ever want to give them too much pressure. So you basically will give breaths but limit the amount of pressure so that the machine will never ever give way too much. The problem with it is that if they have decreased compliance, if they have higher airway resistance, your peak pressures can go up very rapidly when you're delivering a breath, and it'll terminate the breath very prematurely, and you'll never sometimes give enough tidal volume, and you can end up hypoventilating the patient. And then pressure support is something that we would use when we're trying to wean a patient off the vent. Basically, they're awake, they're spontaneously breathing, and you're only giving them a little bit of pressure support whenever they're breathing, so that they're not having to suck in through the endotracheal tube and cause and have to work too hard for that breath. And again, this is only used most of the time in anesthesia, people that are emerging from anesthesia, and then you put them in pressure support to see when they can be extubated, or a patient that's in the ICU that is starting to wake up, they're recovering, they're trying to take them out of take out the mechanical vent. You can put them in pressure support and see how much better they can do spontaneously. So one of the things that you'll hear a lot whenever you're doing your internal medicine, your ICU rotation is lung protective ventilation. Essentially, historically, we've been giving way too much volume on these people, sometimes 10 to 12 mils per kilo of tidal volume, and it's causing their peak pressures to go so high that they're causing barotrauma. There's a study called the ARDS-NET that showed that if you just give them a little bit of tidal volume, and limit the peak pressures, that you do not cause that ventilator-induced lung injury. And the settings for this is peak pressures of 35, so anything below that is okay. Limiting their tidal volume to 4 to 8 mils per kilo, and limiting their FiO2, because what we've been finding is that people would put people on like supernatural levels of FI2, like 100%, and you'll get a PaO2 of like 400, 500s. And what that causes is form superoxides that can be really injurious to the lung and to the patient. So limiting that to only FI2 to only have a saturation between 95 to 98, and limiting and using as much of the PEEP as you can tolerate to limit the amount of FI2. So whenever you have the patients in a mechanical vent, you want them to be on a cardiac monitor to see if there's any kind of changes in hemodynamics. Again, the biggest thing that kills patients on a mechanical vent is dynamic hyperinflation and the increase in thoracic pressure that can cause hypotension and they can die. And then pulse ox, obviously, and the ABG every 30 minutes, whenever 30 minutes after you change the settings, or at least once a day if they're stable. The chest x-ray to make sure that they're not developing complications of pneumothorax or kind of migration of the endotracheal tube. Measuring the plateau pressure, which is the alveolar pressure, keeping that below 30 every 4 hours at the very least. And then the end-tidal CO2, make sure that the patient is getting the adequate amount of minute ventilation. If their end-tidal CO2 is greater than 45, that tells you that the minute ventilation is not enough, that they're developing way too much CO2. Or if their end-tidal CO2 is too low, maybe there's a leak in the system. Again, this is a couple of suggested initial ventilatory settings depending on the scenario that you presented. Say, otherwise normal lungs, you can use AC or ACDC or SIMV with pressure support. If they're kind of a little sedated, a little obtunded, but if they're not, you can just use pressure support. And these are kind of the settings that you can use. Again, trying to emphasize, try to reach a PEEP of less than PEEP 0 or less than 5 in patients with asthma or COPD. And again, low tidal volumes and low respiratory rates so that they can exhale their breaths. And you can do what's called permissive hypercarbia in these patients, kind of like what the other lecturer was talking about. A lot of these patients, say COPD, they're chronically hypercarbic. If you correct their CO2 very quickly, you can make them very alkalotic very fast. So you need to sometimes very slowly correct these patients. Again, additional kind of settings depending on the scenario. Complications of mechanical vent, we talked about correcting the CO2 too rapidly in patients that are chronically hypercarbic can cause respiratory alkalosis. And that has hemodynamic effects. If they become hypercalotic, they end up having sometimes vasoconstriction, and also can cause vasoconstriction in the brain. So very important that you don't do that. You can, if your trigger mechanism is too sensitive, in say COPD asthmatic patients, and they're triggering that vent too much, then they can have excessive minute ventilation and that dynamic hyperinflation and auto PEEP, and which can again lead to patients coding. If you have, say, a leak in the circuit, you can end up hypoventilating these patients, and so it can lead to hypoxemia or increased metabolic demand for that patient. Again, self-extubation, so make sure that these patients that are very agitated, very aggressive, that they're adequately sedated. And if you're having, again, too much pressure in that endotracheal tube, you can cause tracheal necrosis and tracheal malacia down the line. And then the auto PEEP and the auto PEEP, dynamic hyperinflation, and then barotrauma. So say you have a patient that is on a vent, and then they suddenly start to decompensate. Either they become hypotensive or very hypertensive or blood pressure goes down, or they're hypoxic, the first thing that you need to do is what's called a DOAP mnemonic. Assess their tube, make sure that it's not in the right main stem, and then look at the tube whether there's like a mucus plug on there, or is it obstructed because the patient is biting the tube, or if there's like a foreign body on there. Say if somebody aspirated, then that aspirated material ends up migrating in the endotracheal tube, or if they have develop a pneumothorax, or whether the equipment is failing. The thing that you need to do once that happens is you disconnect the patient from the vent, really important, because then it could be that the vent is the issue, and then you have to then bag mask ventilate them manually. And if they're not very difficult to bag, then the problem with the problem with the patient could be just bronchospasm. So you can give them, say, albuterol. And then the next thing that you need to do is, if they're difficult to bag, is to assess that endotracheal tube. You can suction it to see if there's any kind of mucus that's obstructing the airway. And if that's not the cause, then see if the patient is biting that endotracheal tube, or is it malposition, so you can get an X-ray. But if those are not the case, then you need to assess them for other causes. Say, is there a pneumothorax? Is there dynamic hyperinflation, or some other causes of the hypoxemia? Then the other thing that I wanted to talk about is the patient ventilator dysynchrony. Again, if the patient is awake, is not totally sedated, and if your prescribed setting on that vent is not enough to satisfy their demand, those patients can breathe on their own, and you can tell they're agitated, they're over-breathing the vent. Then you need to make sure that the setting that you place is adequate for that patient. So the sedatives that we would usually use in the ICU is a fentanyl, or propofol, or ketamine, or dexmedetomidine. So most of the time, I try to do light sedation, so RASS of -2. That's the scale that you can then write on the orders for the nurse. So say RASS of 0 to -2, so they're not completely totally sedated. So you can always monitor the patient's ability to breathe. So and that kind of helps you, to see if the patient is ready to be extubated or weaned off from the vent. Because then if you have him on deep sedation the entire time, that's going to be very difficult to know when this patient is ready. And then paralysis, we don't usually paralyze patients on the vent unless there's a big reason to. Say a patient is really difficult to ventilate because they have, say, elevated lung compliance, say they're very rigid, then you need to paralyze them so that you can deliver those those breaths. But otherwise, it's not something that we would use regularly. And then, the way that you know that the patient is ready to be weaned from the vent is that they're not requiring too much mechanical ventilation. So say a patient that is lightly sedated or completely awake, and they're not requiring too much FiO2 or too much PEEP, or they're able to pull normal tidal volumes on their own. There's also something what's called the rapid shallow breathing index. Basically, the respiratory rate in the tidal volume is below 100 or 105, and they're able to breathe, inhale an adequate tidal volume, which is 5 mL per kilo, or their vital capacity is greater than 10, the respiratory rate is less than 30, their negative inspiratory force, the amount of pressure that they can generate is greater than 20, then those patients are probably ready to be weaned off and placed in pressure support, ventilation, and then eventually extubated. And that's all I have. Any questions?
When you put a patient and they have the mandatory breath they have to take, do you set that mandatory rate?
Yeah, exactly. So, let's see. So these are the settings that you have to put in.
Okay.
See, there's just a number, and some of them, depending on what kind of ventilation you're going to use, say, if you're in a volume control setting or SIMV, then you have to set the tidal volume, and again, you use that chart, 4 to 8 mils per kilo, and then you set the respiratory rate. Sometimes I aim for 12 to 16. The reason that you would get that ABG 30 minutes post, changing of your setting is you need to look at that PCO2, make sure that you're not giving them too much respiratory rate. Say your PCO2 is starting to go down below 35, then you need to slow down that respiratory rate or decrease that tidal volume.